On the night of July 24th, 1987, 30-year-old Susan Woods stood at the entrance to a local fair in a little city called Hico, located in central Texas, along with her best friend and her best friend's boyfriend. And the three of them were standing there trying to decide if they wanted to continue to stay here or leave. Now, as they're standing there, they can hear people having fun on all the rides. There's kids laughing and they're screaming. I mean, it's a Friday night. They had chosen to come here. This was the activity. But, so far the night had really not been that great. So Susan's best friend, whose name was Cindy Hallmark, and her boyfriend, whose name was Roy Hayes, had convinced Susan to come out with them and come to this fair because Susan's life of late had been really quite bad. She was in the middle of this very ugly divorce, and the new guy that she was dating had sort of wound up being very pushy when it came to physical intimacy, and so she had recently dumped him too. And so, Susan's life, certainly her relationships anyways, were sort of in rough shape. And so Cindy and Roy had convinced Susan to come out with them and just, at least for one night, come enjoy this fair. Just forget about everything else and just come have some fun. And so Susan had agreed to go. However, sort of ironically, once they actually got to the fair and the three of them were walking around and playing games and going into the haunted house and doing all the things you do at the fair, it had been Cindy, not Susan, who had ultimately said that they weren't really having a good time, that they were feeling kind of bad. Cindy said that she just had this really intense feeling that something bad was about to happen. It was like this constant anxiety, and she couldn't shake it, and it was making it really hard to enjoy the night. And so that was why the trio is, standing at the gate, wondering if it's even worth staying here any longer. And ultimately, Roy finally just said, you know what, why don't we just leave and head back to Stephenville? That's where they all lived. It's where they grew up, too. And he said, why don't we go back to Stephenville and we'll just drive around for a bit and eventually we'll go to the Dairy Queen restaurant and we'll get some ice cream. And when Roy suggested this, both Susan and Cindy thought that was a great idea. And so they left, they hopped in Roy's truck, and they began the drive back to Stephenville. About an hour and a half later, Susan, Cindy, and Roy walked into the Stephenville Dairy Queen. They ordered ice cream sundaes and then sat down at a booth. By this point, Cindy's feeling of dread, that something bad was going to happen, had mostly gone away, and so the mood was much lighter. And Susan especially was actually having kind of a great night, the first in a long time it felt like. The last 6 months or so had been some of the worst in Susan's entire life. Her ex-husband, Michael Woods, who she had been with since she was in her early 20s, had effectively abandoned her back in February, taking her car and also some expensive crystals that she had collected, and he had left behind a viciously mean tape recording of all the things he hated about her, along with dozens of cruel notes with insults on them hidden all over the place. And so Susan had filed for divorce, and then instead of trying to get her car back from her husband, who was long gone, she just began doing a ton of overtime at the sandpaper factory in order to afford another car. And so in these few months immediately following the breakup with her ex and all this extra work she was doing, Susan had really fallen into a deep depression. But it had been Cindy and Roy who had helped kind of pull herself back together. Susan was naturally very shy, and she did not have a big social circle. But Cindy, on the other hand, was very extroverted, had a ton of friends and a lot of close cousins. And so she had persuaded Susan to begin coming to their regular meetups with all her friends and cousins. The core group that typically attended these meetups was Cindy, Roy, Cindy's cousins, Regina and Scott Hatley, and then maybe one or two others. And collectively, they referred to themselves as the members of the round table, because often these meetups consisted of just spending the whole night sitting around Cindy's round kitchen table, talking and drinking. The first time Susan had gone, it had seemed like such a tight-knit group that she really just kind of felt like a third wheel and did not belong. But everyone had really treated her like she did belong. And these days, she did not miss a meetup because this was like her new community. It really made her happy. And so slowly but surely, Susan had begun to feel better, largely because of these meetups. And so now, as she looked across the table at Cindy jokingly trying to force-feed Roy all this ice cream, Susan just smiled. Roy was this big guy, but he was losing the fight, and he had chocolate sauce all over his chin. They were just kind of goofing around. She just thought to herself, you know what? Tonight was a great night. My life, it's turning around. And suddenly, she had an idea. Susan stood up from the table, and without saying anything, she walked up to the counter, and she promptly ordered a second hot fudge sundae. And when she carried it back over to the table with a big grin on her face, Cindy and Roy kind of looked at her surprised, and were kind of impressed even, which was exactly the reaction that Susan was hoping for. Normally, Susan was very conscious of her weight and wouldn't even finish one sundae. But tonight, she just felt like, you know what? I have been set free. I'm just going to have fun. But unfortunately for Susan, the ice cream sundaes were really the last fun thing she got to enjoy that entire weekend, because she spent all day Saturday on the line at the sandpaper factory where she worked, and then all day Sunday she was grocery shopping, doing laundry, and straightening up the house. By about 8 p.m. Sunday night, she had put away all of her laundry, she had made the bed, and picked up the last few items off the bedroom floor. Her house was small, but it was finally starting to feel like hers again. When her ex-husband Michael had first left, even though he had gone 1,000 miles away to Indiana, she had felt afraid in her house, like he might suddenly come back. And so she'd actually had Cindy sleep over her house for a while to help her feel safe, and also she asked Roy to literally nail all her windows shut. But despite fortifying her living space, what Susan couldn't escape from were all these awful little notes that Michael had left behind and hidden all over the house. All these awful messages, just basically telling Susan all these terrible things about her and how much he hated her. She kept finding them all the time. But as of right now, the house was neat and tidy, and Susan by this point believed she had found, almost every note, or certainly close to every note. So, to celebrate, Susan headed over to the couch and sat down and turned on the TV. Her plan was just to watch a couple of shows and just enjoy the peace and quiet, and then go to bed, because tomorrow she would have to get up early for work. As she was sitting there, flipping through the channels trying to figure out what she wanted to watch, she heard a knock on the front door. Two days later, at 6 p.m. on the afternoon of July 28th, Susan's father, Joe Atkins, was at home when his phone rang. And when he picked it up, it was Susan's manager at the sandpaper factory, which was weird. The manager told him that he was calling because Susan had not shown up to work for the past 2 days, and nobody could get a hold of her. And so he was wondering if Joe knew where she was. Joe frowned and said no, he didn't know, but he would go find out. He hung up and he immediately dialed Susan's number. And when she didn't answer, he didn't think twice. He just put the phone down, grabbed his keys, hurried out to his truck, and started driving towards Susan's place. A half an hour later, Joe pulled up outside of Susan's house and he went up to her front door. And when he knocked, nobody answered. But he could hear the TV on inside. And when he tried the doorknob, he found the door was unlocked. He opened the door up a little bit and he poked his head inside and he called his daughter's name. But he didn't get a response. So he stepped all the way inside. The house was basically clean, except there were snacks out on the coffee table and the TV was still on, and it was on pretty loud. But also, there were some cigarettes that had been burned out in an ashtray on the coffee table, and Joe knew his daughter didn't smoke. And so at this point, everything told him something is wrong. So Joe walked through the living room and into his daughter's bedroom. And his daughter was not in there, but the bed was a mess. The sheets and the bedding had all been ripped off and were sitting in a heap on the floor, and the mattress itself was hanging off the box spring. Joe was about to leave and search the rest of the house when he noticed the bathroom door in the bedroom was open. Joe forced himself to step toward the door, and as he did, his heart began to hammer in his chest. And then, when he leaned around the door and looked inside the bathroom, he just froze. For what felt like a very long time, but was very likely only a few seconds, Joe didn't move or breathe. Then, it's like he broke out of his fog, he stumbled backwards, he ran to the living room, grabbed the phone, and he called 911. Sergeant Donnie Hensley of the Stephenville Police Department had just gotten home after a pretty long shift when he got a call from dispatch to head back out again. A homicide had just been called in, and every available officer had to head to the scene right away. The dispatcher did not have many details, but they did know that the victim was a young woman and that she had been found by her father inside of her home. When Hensley got to the address, he found there was an ambulance there and a couple of fire trucks and police cars and a whole bunch of police officers that were already out and about stringing up crime scene tape. But he also saw someone that he was not expecting to see. It was a friend of his, a guy he knew who volunteered at the town's golf course. His name was Joe Atkins. So he walked over and he asked Joe, like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" But the instant he asked that question, and when Joe turned around to look at him, Hensley understood why he was here. He suddenly remembered that Joe had a daughter, and based on the look on Joe's face, clearly his daughter was the murder victim. Joe had found her. Hensley was a hardened detective who had been to plenty of crime scenes by this point, and he had seen some terrible things. But the pure grief on his friend's face was too much for him to bear. He knew there was nothing he could do to take Joe's pain away. So instead, without saying anything, Hensley took Joe's hands, and the two men just stood there and prayed. And then after a few minutes, he let go of Joe's hands, and then he turned and walked up Susan's front steps to begin the search for her killer. The crime scene unit was already inside of Susan's home, hard at work, by the time Detective Hensley walked through the front door. A supervisor walked over and brought Hensley up to speed. They told him that Susan's body was in the bathroom, and from the looks of it, she'd been dead for a while. The front door had been unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Susan may have let her killer inside. Detectives were now dividing up the house into quadrants to examine each part of the crime scene, and Hensley would be working primarily in the bedroom. But the supervisor warned Hensley that the crime itself was incredibly brutal, likely bordering on torture, and he should just mentally prepare himself. Hensley nodded, and for a moment he just stood there and collected himself and took stock of the scene. He looked over at the coffee table in the living room, and he saw it was covered with snacks, including a bag of potato chips, a pack of Twinkies, and an open Coke can. And there was an ashtray with 6 cigarette butts inside of it. It looked like more food and more cigarettes than one person would reasonably consume, and so maybe Susan had had company. But otherwise, the house was clean and pretty unremarkable. Except for one thing that took Hensley a minute to notice. And what it was is all the windows were nailed shut from the inside. Susan clearly must have been scared of somebody breaking in. And so naturally, Hensley wondered if maybe the person she was scared of breaking in was the same person who wound up killing her. But if that was the case, why had she apparently opened the door for this person? At this point, Hensley moved into the bedroom. And as soon as he did, he could tell there had to have been a struggle in here, because the mattress was hanging off the box spring, the sheets had been pulled off, and they were heaped up on the floor. And there were all these scuff marks on the floor that suggested the bed very likely had been moved, dragged around inside of the room. There was also a white extension cord lying on the mattress, and also there was this pillow that had all these strange black smudges on it. Hensley walked over and looked at this pillowcase, trying to figure out what the smudges could be, and then he realized it was mascara. The pillow must have been held over Susan's face to suffocate her. But when Hensley walked into the bathroom and saw what was in there, despite the warning he was given about how brutal it was, he still was taken aback and found himself gasping. Susan's body was draped over the side of the tub, with her head still in the water. At first glance, it was obvious Susan was dead, because her head and shoulders that were underwater were severely decomposed from being in the water. And so at this point, Hensley realized that whoever murdered Susan had likely sexually assaulted her, strangled her, smothered her, and then held her body underwater. I mean, this had been a savage attack committed by a monster. However, Hensley also realized that this monster, whoever had done this, had made at least one mistake, because one of the crime scene techs that was in the bathroom was pointing at the tub with excitement. And when Hensley looked at what they were pointing at, you could see perfectly clearly there was a set of palm prints, almost certainly left behind by the killer. The following morning at around 10 a.m., Sergeant Hensley walked into the Stephenville police station and promptly filled up a paper cup from the bullpen water cooler and drank it down. It was over 90 degrees outside, and he had just spent all morning and a lot of the previous night canvassing the neighborhood where Susan had been murdered. But despite all their efforts, they really hadn't gotten much. Susan had been found on Tuesday, but nobody had reported seeing her on Tuesday or the Monday before or the Sunday before, which left a window of 3 days for this murder to have taken place. One of Susan's neighbors did remember seeing a, quote, large-framed man park his truck near Susan's house on Sunday night, but that described a lot of the men in Stephenville, so that didn't really narrow anything down. Now, the police chief had not yet assigned a lead investigator to Susan's case, but because Sergeant Hensley knew Susan's father personally, he was hoping to stay involved. So after drinking a second cup full of water, Hensley headed down the hall to the chief's office, where he asked to see Susan's autopsy report. The chief's secretary handed it over, and Hensley quickly began to thumb through the pages. But he quickly realized there really was almost nothing here that he didn't already know. The report confirmed that Susan had been sexually assaulted, but her body was so decomposed, it was impossible to determine exactly how or when she had died, although the coroner estimated she'd been in the tub for roughly 2 days. But right at that moment, another investigator named Lieutenant Ken Maltby walked up and grabbed the report right out of Hensley's hands. And before Hensley could protest, Maltby walked back to the bullpen and rapped his knuckles on a door frame to get everybody's attention. Then Maltby announced that he would be taking over Susan's case, so everybody else, Hensley included, should back off. And Hensley did not like this, not only because, he had this closeness with Susan's father, but also because he had a feeling that Maltby was only interested in this case because he thought it would help his career. However, Maltby outranked Hensley, and Hensley already had a full caseload of work, so there really was very little he could do here. So, with a resigned sigh, he headed back to his desk. Two days later, around 2 p.m. on July 31st, Sergeant Hensley stood in the back of a small crowd, sweating through his suit, as Susan's casket was lowered into the ground. Hensley was at this funeral really to support Susan's father, Joe, because he was not really a part of the investigation. However, he couldn't help, scanning the mourners, through a detective's lens to see if anybody seemed suspicious. There was a group of people in their 20s and 30s that were standing towards the front, and Hensley assumed they must be Susan's friends. He remembered what one of Susan's neighbors had said about a large-framed man, and he looked at all the men, taking note of their size. At the center of the group, there was a blonde woman who was sobbing, and Hensley recognized her as Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, who was leaning on her boyfriend, Roy Hayes. The two of them had actually come to the crime scene by coincidence on the day Susan's body was found, and they had totally broken down when they realized what had happened. But now, Hensley was suddenly noticing just how physically enormous Roy was. And so in that moment, Hensley thought to himself, if he was in charge of this case, he knew Roy would be somebody he'd take a close look at. But that was not his decision. But then Hensley noticed that there was actually one person who was conspicuously absent from this funeral, and that was Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. From what Hensley had heard around the station, nearly all of Susan's friends and family were convinced that it was Michael who was the killer. But there was a problem with this theory. Michael lived 1,000 miles away in Indianapolis, and word around the police station was that during that window of time where Susan was murdered over those 3 days, Michael was in Indianapolis, and he was around loads of people who would vouch for him being in Indianapolis, which meant that, as far as Hensley knew, there really was no way for Michael to be the killer. And so Hensley just hoped that Lieutenant Maltby had another, better suspect in mind. For the next few weeks, Sergeant Hensley focused on his own cases, while still keeping tabs on Susan's. Every couple of days, her dad would call him up and ask why Michael hadn't been arrested yet, and Hensley would always tell him that the case was in good hands and they're working on it. But as the weeks passed by with no arrests, Hensley started to wonder, what was going on here? Something needs to happen. Why is nothing happening? Then one day in early October, so roughly 2 months after Susan's murder, Hensley walked into the bullpen to find Maltby celebrating. Not because of any progress in the case, though, but to celebrate his big promotion. Maltby was going to be the lead of a new narcotics unit, and his open cases that he had been working on were just going to be, given to other investigators or filed away altogether. And so as Maltby accepted congratulations from other officers and just made a whole scene, all Sergeant Hensley could think was, well, what's going to happen to Susan's case? It could easily fall through the cracks here. And so without even talking to Maltby, Hensley walked straight to the chief's office and asked to take the case over. The chief shrugged and just said, sure, you're welcome to try, so long as this case does not get in the way of his other work. Hensley agreed and then went to get Susan's file, And then after he had it in hand, he hurried back to his desk and began rifling through the pages. And he was stunned to find that there was almost nothing in there besides the original autopsy report. And that's when Hensley remembered that Lieutenant Maltby claimed to have this photographic memory, and so he almost never took notes. And so Hensley was basically going to have to start all over from square one. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Hensley sat down in the kitchen of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, as Cindy poured them both a cup of coffee, and then Cindy started talking. And she had a lot to say. She was absolutely convinced that Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, was the killer, and she just could not understand why it was taking detectives so long to arrest him. Cindy said, for most of Susan and Michael's relationship, Michael was just kind of a loser. He couldn't keep a job, and he'd just lift weights and play guitars shirtless in the front yard. However, when they had broken up, Michael had recorded this totally unhinged audio recording about how awful Susan was and left it for Susan, along with all these notes he had hid all around the house and the property, which also just said terrible things about Susan. And this behavior by Michael had scared Susan so much that she had asked Cindy and Cindy's boyfriend Roy to help nail all her windows shut, specifically to prevent Michael from coming into the house. Hensley listened and wrote everything Cindy said down, but he really wasn't as sold on the Michael Woods theory as everybody else in Stephenville seemed to be. And that was primarily because the police in Indianapolis had spoken to Michael, and apparently he had given them a rock-solid alibi. And so realistically, it didn't make sense for him to be the killer. That said, Hensley was pretty confident that the killer had to be somebody Susan knew. The lack of forced entry, coupled with all the snacks and the Coke can and cigarettes on her coffee table, suggested that Susan might have entertained her murderer before they killed her. And so at this point, Hensley was much more interested in learning if there were other romantic interests in Susan's life, besides Michael. And when he asked Cindy that question, she said, yeah, there was one other guy. She said right before Susan was killed, she was seeing this bartender named J.C. Bauman. However, they'd only gone on a few dates. Cindy said that J.C. had put a lot of pressure on Susan to sleep with him, and so she had just broken up with him. And when Hensley heard this, he felt like this was really promising. And so when Cindy finished telling her J.C. story, he asked her if she knew where he could find J.C. And she said yeah, and she gave him the address of the bar where he worked. 45 minutes later, Sergeant Hensley pulled up in front of the bar. It was still too early for business, but there was a delivery truck out front, and there were a few men who were unloading kegs and bringing them inside. And so Hensley walked up to these guys, and he asked if any of them knew a J.C. Bauman. And this tall, bearded man raised his hand and said, actually, that was him. A few minutes later, Hensley and J.C. were sitting at the empty bar. Hensley watched J.C.'s face very closely as he explained to him that he was here to talk about Susan. J.C. nodded and ran his fingers through his hair like he was nervous. And then he said his throat was dry and asked Sergeant Hensley if he wanted something to drink. Sergeant Hensley said he was okay, but J.C. he got up, went behind the bar, and then came back with a can of Coke. And after sitting down and opening the drink up and taking a sip, J.C. also lit up a cigarette. And so immediately, Hensley thought of the Coke can that was on Susan's coffee table, as well as the ashtray full of cigarettes, despite the fact that Susan was not a smoker. And so the interview had barely even started, and Hensley was already very suspicious of JC. So he decided to push pretty early and see how JC reacted under some serious pressure. And so right out the gate, he asked JC where he was on Sunday, July 26th, which was the day investigators at this point believed Susan was murdered, based primarily on the autopsy report. And when JC was asked that, he swallowed and said he couldn't remember, which was possible. I mean, the murder happened 2 months earlier, but it didn't make JC look that good. So Hensley asked JC if it was true that he and Susan broke up ultimately because he, JC, had pressured her for sex. JC turned beet red and said he had never pressured Susan. He said they had been intimate, but just once in Susan's bathtub. And when Hensley heard this, he nearly dropped his pen. it seemed extremely suspicious that JC was claiming to have been intimate with Susan in the same bathtub where she was found dead. And so Hensley wondered if he was maybe trying to get ahead of the fact that his fingerprints would be found on or in that bathtub. Now, legally, Hensley knew he could not compel JC to offer up his fingerprints without charging him first. But he took a chance and just asked anyway. And to his surprise, JC said, "Yes, you can have my fingerprints." And he almost seemed relieved. He said, "Whatever you need to help solve Susan's murder, I'll do it." 2 hours later, Sergeant Hensley was back at his desk in the Stephenville police station looking at a card that had JC's finger and palm prints on it. And as he looked at it, he began thinking about those palm prints on Susan's bathtub. In 1987, fingerprints and palm prints were just much slower to process than they are today. And the closest lab that analyzed these prints was an hour and a half away in Fort Worth. And Hensley knew they were always working with a backlog, so his results could easily take months. But Hensley was not going to just sit around and wait, because he had one more suspect he wanted to talk to. The following afternoon, Sergeant Hensley walked into an interrogation room at the police station and sat down across from Roy Hayes, who was Susan's best friend, Cindy's boyfriend. Hensley wanted to speak to Roy for two reasons. One, he matched the physical description of the large man seen near Susan's house around the time of her murder. And two, there just weren't that many people who were close to Susan. And Roy saw her when she was both with Cindy and also when she would attend those members of the Round Table get-togethers. Now, that was not that incriminating, but Hensley knew that catching the killer was as much about ruling suspects out as it was about ruling them in. So that was really all he was trying to do here with Roy, is just maybe find a way to say, nope, not him. But before Hensley could even begin asking Roy questions, Roy just started talking. He told Hensley that he had been thinking about Susan's case nonstop. He said that his mind had been running wild with all the possible ways the killer could have gotten inside. And so now Roy was eager to share his theories. After all, he said he was the one who nailed those windows shut, so he knew where the weaknesses in her house were. And so Hensley said, "Okay, let's hear your theories." And Roy began listing all the ways a person might be able to get inside of Susan's house, including what Roy said was the most promising, which was a 6-inch crack in the window above the kitchen sink. And as Roy did this, all of a sudden, he was at the top of Hensley's suspect list. And when Roy was done rattling off all the ways he would break into Susan's house, Hensley asked him, "Where were you on the evening of Sunday, July 26th?" And Hensley watched as Roy's expression changed from very intense to surprised, as he realized he was now being asked for his own alibi. Roy started stumbling over another very long, rambly answer, and what he had to say ultimately just made him look even more guilty. Because Roy told Hensley that on the night Susan was killed, he had been over at a friend's house playing a game called Dungeons & Dragons. So today, people know Dungeons & Dragons as a harmless fantasy role-playing game. But at this time in 1987, it was viewed very differently. In the late 1980s in America, there was this huge fear that certain games, books, and heavy metal songs were all linked to devil worship. The TV news ran regular stories across the country about how Dungeons & Dragons specifically encouraged players to cast spells and practice witchcraft. And the local paper in Stephenville had carried a full-page ad calling the game satanic. So when Roy told Hensley he had been playing Dungeons & Dragons on the night Susan was killed, Hensley immediately thought back to the horrible brutality of the crime scene. And he wondered if maybe Susan's murder could have been tied to some kind of dark ritual. And so Hensley looks at Roy and says, "Okay, well, are you prepared to give us your fingerprints?" And Roy said, "Yeah." A half an hour later, a very disappointed Sergeant Hensley watched Roy walk away from the station. Just like with JC, Roy had seemed incredibly suspicious at the start of the interview, but then he'd easily offered up his fingerprints like he wasn't concerned at all about whether they'd matched the killers. So Hensley was not sure what to expect in terms of results here. But he still sent Roy's prints off to the outside lab to be added to the queue behind JC's. Hensley was contemplating his next move when the station receptionist walked over and said that someone from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was on the line for him. They were following up on the inquiry he had made a few days earlier to double-check the alibi of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. Hensley eagerly ran to the phone, and when he heard what the officer had to say, he practically jumped out of his chair. Because according to the Indianapolis police officer, it was true that Michael said he had an alibi with lots of witnesses, but he had promised to provide the names and contact information for all those witnesses, and he had never done it. Which meant Michael's alibi, the same one Stephenville police used to rule him out as a suspect, or more specifically, they used the idea of his alibi, the belief that his alibi existed, that's what they used to rule him out. Well, clearly, it was totally unverified. Lieutenant Ken Maltby, who was in charge of the case when this decision was made, had just completely dropped the ball. Somebody had to check Michael's alibi. On a bright morning in April of 1988, Sergeant Hensley walked out of the Indianapolis International Airport with a single duffel bag of luggage slung over his shoulder. He was here to try to collect the fingerprints of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, who was now Hensley's primary suspect. Hensley had been trying to coordinate the investigation into Michael from Stephenville, Texas, but it had proven to be kind of cumbersome, and so he decided to just take matters into his own hands and actually go to Indianapolis. He knew Michael did not have to submit to fingerprinting unless he was charged with a crime, so Hensley had come up with a plan. He was going to put Michael under surveillance and wait for him to do something illegal. Maybe he gets into a fight or an altercation, or he buys some marijuana, or even jaywalked, anything. Hensley would use it as an excuse to arrest him and get his prints. For days, Hensley sat in an unmarked van outside the house where Michael lived, watching the front door through a telephoto camera lens. But Michael and his roommates seemed pretty boring. They barely even left the house. Hensley was beginning to think that his big plan to catch Michael doing something illegal was a huge waste of time. It just was not going to happen. But then one morning, he noticed some unusual activity in Michael's front yard. Michael and his roommates were laying out furniture and clothing on their front lawn, clearly getting ready for a yard sale. Sergeant Hensley was snapping photos of everything they were bringing out, and at one point, he saw something that gave him a rush of excitement. Because through his lens, he spotted these crystal figurines that appeared to be the exact same type of crystal figurines that Michael had allegedly stolen from Susan's house in Stephenville when their marriage had ended and he had left to go to Indianapolis. Hensley practically laughed out loud. I mean, this was too easy. This was his chance. So he called the local police, and they stormed the yard sale, and they arrested Michael for theft. 2 weeks later, now back in Stephenville, Sergeant Hensley walked into the police station to start a shift, and he found a manila envelope waiting for him. It had a return address that said it was from the Texas DPS Crime Lab in Fort Worth, Texas, where he had sent all of the suspects' fingerprints. Hensley ripped open the envelope and dumped the contents onto the table, and as he began looking through them, he realized the lab had already analyzed all 3 sets of prints that he had sent in. They were Susan's ex-boyfriend, J.C. Bauman, her best friend's boyfriend, Roy Hayes, and her ex-husband, Michael Woods. Now, at this point, if Hensley had had to guess who the killer was, he would have guessed Michael, because Michael is this estranged ex-husband who had left behind these terrible recordings and notes, and he had spooked Susan so badly at the end of their relationship, she had nailed her windows shut to keep him out. And then also, his alibi was sort of up in the air. They didn't really know if he had one or not. They hadn't been able to actually verify it or not yet. JC also had basically no alibi. He drank Coke and he smoked cigarettes, just like the killer had left in Susan's living room, or is believed to have been the killer who left those behind. And Roy, in virtue of playing Dungeons and Dragons, could potentially be involved in Satanism. And also, he seemed way too eager to talk about how he might break into Susan's house. However, for Hensley, he felt like one of these 3 men is the killer. He's about to get his answer. But as he read through each of these reports, he went from exhilaration to confusion, and finally just total disbelief, because none of these prints that he'd submitted matched the ones from Susan's tub. Hensley wanted so badly to solve this case, to give Susan's father Joe, his friend, some closure. But now, he felt like he was totally out of ideas. Susan's case ultimately went completely cold. Sergeant Hensley retired, and 19 years passed by. And then one day, in early 2006, Lieutenant Don Miller of the Stephenville Police Department took a box labeled Susan Woods down from a shelf in evidence storage, carried it back to his office, sat down at his desk, and began to look through its contents. Miller had recently been tasked with reviewing the department's unsolved cases, including Susan's. He read all of Sergeant Hensley's notes, he studied the crime scene photos, and he reviewed all the witness statements. None of it looked very promising. In fact, it looked like all the suspects had basically been ruled out. But then he saw those palm prints that had been lifted from Susan's bathtub, which had never been matched to anyone, and he had an idea. Back in 1987, there had been no centralized database of fingerprints. This meant that unless you had a specific suspect to compare an unknown prints against, the unknown print was effectively useless. And that's really what had happened in Susan's case. None of the suspects had matched this unknown print, so the case was put on a shelf. But in 2006, the FBI now had a national database of all the fingerprints of everybody in America who had ever been arrested and fingerprinted. And this meant that if Susan's killer had ever been arrested for any crime anywhere, their fingerprints would likely be in that database. Now, Lieutenant Miller did not have the budget or the time for a full-blown reinvestigation here, but he certainly had the time and money to just submit those prints into this FBI database to just see if there was a hit. So he submitted them and then put her case file back in storage. And sure enough, a few days later, Miller was at his desk when his phone rang, and it was the FBI, and they told him they had found a match. But when the FBI agent told Miller the name of the person whose prints these matched, it meant nothing to Miller. He didn't think he'd actually even heard the name before, and the person had been arrested for robbery in Nevada, not Texas. Miller thanked the agent, and he quickly began digging through this person's history, and he also went and got the Susan Woods case file. And slowly but surely, it all began to come together. And as Miller read through in her file all the names of the people that Susan spent her time with, he noticed something. And finally, it all just clicked. Lieutenant Miller had found the killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and the killer's written confession, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Susan Woods on the evening of Sunday, July 26, 1987. Stephenville's Main Street was busy as the killer drove through town in their brown pickup, sipping a mixture of soda, vodka, and cough syrup. They stared out their window at all the happy people in the restaurants and the storefronts, and as they stared at these people, a darkness stirred inside the killer. This darkness had been there for years, telling the killer they were no good and they would never be close to anyone. Alcohol was the only thing that seemed to make this darkness go away, so the killer stayed half drunk most of the time. But sometimes, even the alcohol wasn't enough. A few years back, when the TV news had been running non-stop with talk about devil worshipping, the killer had been sort of inspired, and they thought they might try that. And so they had lit a bunch of candles and set them around their room in the shape of a pentagram, and then the killer stripped off their clothes, they stretched out on the floor, and they offered up their soul to the devil in exchange for freedom from this darkness. But unfortunately, the darkness remained. And so now, the killer, feeling very riled up, took another drink and thought of Susan and the way she'd smiled at them the last time they had seen each other. The killer had not had the courage to make a move back then, but now, with this buzz that they had from their drink, they really couldn't see a good reason not to make a pass at Susan. So they turned off the main road and they drove the short distance to Susan's house. In a matter of minutes, the killer was at her door, knocking. Susan opened the door and surprise flashed across her face, but then it softened into a smile and she told them to come on in. Susan told them to get comfortable, and as they sat down on the couch, she went to the kitchen to get the killer a Coke and some snacks. Then she brought them back, and She sat down on the couch next to the killer to talk and catch up. And that was when the killer made their move. They leaned in to kiss her. But Susan immediately pulled back, suddenly angry. The killer grabbed her, and Susan slapped them across the face. And right then, the killer exploded. It would take almost 20 years, but that single action of the killer placing their hands on the bathtub did eventually give Lieutenant Miller the killer's identity. He was the younger cousin of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, and he was one of the members of that roundtable group who supported Susan through her divorce. He had also been at Susan's funeral and helped her friends through the aftermath of her death. The killer's name was Scott Hatley, and just a week before he killed her, he had been hanging out with the members of the round table, and Susan was there. And Susan, who was this, very shy, gentle person, had sort of opened up around this group. She was feeling happier and happier, largely because this group of friends, including Scott, had been so supportive. She really felt like she belonged here and was safe here. And during that meeting amongst the members of the round table, just sort of inexplicably, Susan had looked over at Scott and simply smiled at him. And for that reason pretty much alone, Scott, a week later, had shown up on her doorstep and murdered her. By the time Lieutenant Miller put all of this together, Hatley was 41 years old and was still a free man. And so on June 7, 2006, Miller had him arrested and charged him with Susan's murder. He would ultimately take a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but would only serve 11 years before he was released for good behavior. However, 3 years after Hatley got out of prison, he was found dead inside of his RV from cancer complications. And among his things, investigators would find this handwritten diary where he confessed to Susan's murder. The pages were also filled with references to Satan and demons, and Hatley specifically wrote that some kind of outside presence had been responsible for pushing him to ultimately assault and kill Susan. Evening of July 25th, 2008, a 59-year-old man named Brian Thomas walked hand in hand with his wife Christine out of the restaurant where they had just had dinner. The couple was in this little village right on the coast of Wales, and where they were now walking outside of this restaurant was right along the water. And so as they did that, Brian found himself looking out over the sea, and he saw the reflection of the moon on the waves, and it was so beautiful. And then he turned to his wife, and she was so stunning. And so Brian finally just stopped and kind of just took in all this incredible beauty right in front of him, and he began smiling ear to ear, which was a big departure from how Brian had been feeling over the past few months, because Christine had recently had a big scare. She'd been told she might have cancer, and so she went in for all this testing, and then she and Brian had to wait for it to come back, and the wait was absolute torture. I mean, basically Brian and Christine were prepping themselves to find out Christine really did have cancer. But when the results did come back, it would turn out Christine did not have cancer, and so Christine was obviously hugely relieved, but it was actually Brian who was more relieved. It was like he suddenly saw he could lose his wife of 40 years, who he had raised a family with. I mean, this was like the most important person in Brian's life, but it was like he didn't fully appreciate that until he realized he could lose this really important person. And so now that Christine had a clean bill of health, Brian was committed to showering her with love and affection and taking her to restaurants and on vacations. And in fact, the reason they were actually in this village in Wales is because they were on one of Brian's many vacations for Christine. He had gone out and bought this little camper van, and they had driven it up to this part of Wales. And then after this vacation ended, Brian's plan was to use this camper to travel with his wife all over Great Britain. And so the couple had a really busy schedule coming up. But for right now, Brian was focused on just staying in the moment and enjoying this newfound happiness he was feeling. And so he and his wife would continue to just kind of walk along the water for a bit. And then finally, when they felt tired, they headed back to their camper, they went inside, they got in their bed, and they fell asleep. A little before 4 a.m., Brian suddenly woke up inside of this camper. And so he sits upright and he looks around. It's totally dark inside of there. He can't see anything. He doesn't really know why he just woke up. And he's trying to get his bearings. And then as his eyes kind of begin to focus, he realizes there is a person standing inside of their camper right near the door. Basically 10, 15 feet away from he and his wife is a person And so Brian just froze and he's staring at this person, hoping this is just a dream or something. But then this person, who appeared to be dressed in all black head to toe, began to move. And they began to move first to the left and then towards the bed. And so Brian is still just frozen, thinking, is this real? Is this really happening? And then this person began climbing on the bed on the side where Christine was. And so Brian, without even thinking, just yelled out, "You bastard!" And he jumped off the bed at this guy and began choking them out. And the whole time Brian is screaming at this person, like, "What are you doing? Why are you here?" And this person is fighting back so hard, and Brian is just not letting go. It's like instinct is completely taken over, and then this person goes totally still and just dies. And Brian knows he killed them, but they came into his camper. Like, what do you expect? Brian would ultimately be the one who called the police, and just several minutes later they would show up, and when they got there they would find Brian standing outside the camper hyperventilating. And then when they tried to get more information about what exactly had happened inside the camper, Brian basically couldn't explain it. It was like he was totally in shock. And so eventually one of the officers just went inside the camper, and there on the ground they would find a body. But it was not some attacker. It was Brian's wife. It would turn out Brian had a medical condition called somnambulism, which we know as sleepwalking. And at home, he would sleep in a different bed than his wife because he sleepwalked so much. But since they were on vacation in their camper, they had to sleep together because there was only one bed on board the camper. And so not long after Brian and Christine had fallen asleep together, Brian began having this really intense nightmare where he believed his wife was being attacked. And so Brian, in this nightmare, had to stop this person from hurting Christine. Except because of his sleepwalking, he acted this out in real life. And the attacker that he ultimately killed was ironically his wife. He basically tackled his wife and strangled her to death because he thought he was actually saving her. Brian was absolutely destroyed with grief and with guilt, and the second he realized what he had done, he confessed. He didn't in any way try to protect himself. He said, "I did this, take me in." And Brian would be arrested. However, in November of 2009, the judge who actually heard Brian's official confession, he kind of felt bad for Brian and said, "You know what, I'm dropping all charges against you because it's obvious to me you are a good and decent person. This was a mistake, and you're gonna live with grief and guilt for the rest of your life, and that's punishment enough." One morning in January of 2016, a 45-year-old woman named Lauren walked into an office building in West Virginia where she worked as an office manager, and she dropped her purse, her phone, and her cigarettes on her desk. It was a Friday, and so Lauren was in a really good mood because she was pumped about the weekend. The next day, Saturday, she and her husband Dan planned to go on this big hike together. They loved hiking, so that was going to be awesome. And then on Sunday, Lauren planned to stay home all day and cook one big meal because it had become a tradition in their family that on Sundays, Lauren and Dan's kids, they had 3 kids who were all grown up, they would come back home to their parents' house and they would have a big family meal together. And these dinners were definitely the highlight of the week for Lauren and for Dan because both of them were very family-centric. Lauren switched on her computer and then looked at her schedule and saw she had a whole bunch of meetings back to back to back that day. And so immediately she was worried that she would not be able to slip out that day and go for a quick walk, something she had recently been doing a lot of because her doctor had recently told her that she had a blood circulation disorder that was called peripheral vascular disease. And what that meant was the arteries that carried the blood from her heart down to her legs and her feet were becoming blocked. And so her legs and feet were not getting enough oxygen. So far, her only symptoms were the occasional leg cramp, but if the disease got worse, it could lead to pain and mobility issues, and also heart attack and stroke. Luckily, Lauren's doctor told her that she didn't need medication, she just needed to quit smoking, change her diet, and become more physically active. And Lauren had totally leaned into this and was being much more active and had changed her diet. She hadn't quit smoking yet, but she planned to. And so Lauren really felt like she was on the right track. And so as Lauren kind of began her day, going through her emails and thinking about when she's going to do this walk, her cell phone rang. When Lauren looked at the phone, she didn't recognize the number, so she decided to let it go to voicemail. And so Lauren forgot about her phone and just figured whoever this was, they'd call back or whatever, and she's doing her thing. But then she got another phone call. And when she looked, it was the same number calling her back. And this time, Lauren did pick up the phone, and when she said hello, on the other end of the line, she heard a police officer say in a very serious voice, "Am I speaking to Dan's wife?" And so right away, Lauren's heart began to race, and she would tell the officer, yes, what's going on? And all the officer would tell her is that Dan, unfortunately, was in a very serious car accident, and so you need to come to the scene right away. In an absolute panic, Lauren hung up the phone, she grabbed her things, she ran out to the car, and she floored her way to the address the police officer gave her. But when she got there, she saw there were so many police cars and ambulances and all these people that she couldn't even see what was going on, let alone park anywhere near where this accident happened. So she wound up parking her car around the corner, and then she got out and just sprinted towards all the police. And then when she got up to them, she basically began pushing people out of the way, and no one tried to stop her. They could tell, this woman must know the people involved in this crash. And so she pushed past all these people, and finally she can see through the crowd, and she can see her husband's car, and it's absolutely mangled. And there's all these first responders that are in a circle on the pavement, and she can tell there is somebody on the ground they're working on, and it's gotta be Dan. And so Lauren just began running towards that group of people, and as she did, they all stood up as if, there was nothing they could do. And on the ground, Lauren saw her husband. There was Dan lying in this huge pool of blood, just motionless on the ground. And so before she even got over to her husband, Lauren already knew what had happened. Dan was dead. And so Lauren let out this primal shriek and just rushed over to her husband and fell to the ground next to him, holding his body and crying hysterically. And all the EMTs and first responders, they knew this woman has just lost her husband. And even though she shouldn't be here right now, they just felt like they have to give this moment to her. And so the police and the EMTs and the rest of the first responders, instead of even talking to Lauren or trying to get her to go somewhere else, they just formed a big circle, shoulder to shoulder, around Lauren and Dan, and just allowed Lauren to grieve in private. About 2 hours later, Lauren returned to her home in a daze. Dan's body had already been transported to the morgue, and a police officer had driven Lauren back to her home where her 3 kids, her son and her 2 daughters, were now waiting for her. And so when Lauren went inside the house and went into the living room where her kids were, her kids, who already knew what had happened, they just immediately swarmed her and hugged her, and they all just cried together. I mean, this was so horrible and so unexpected that nobody knew what to do. Finally, Lauren tried to speak through her sobs, but when she did, she just couldn't get words out. It was like her chest was so tight she couldn't even speak. And then suddenly, Lauren realized this pressure on her chest was very real, and it was getting worse and worse, to the point where it was genuinely hard to take a breath in. And so Lauren actually said to her kids, "I think I'm having a panic attack." And so her daughter ran to the kitchen to get some water. And as she did, Lauren took a seat on the couch to try to calm down. But by the time her daughter came back with the glass of water, Lauren straight up just could not breathe. I mean, she was trying to pull air in, but it wasn't going in, and she was totally panicking. And so she looked at her kids and just mouthed the words, "I can't breathe." At which point the kids understood, like, this is way beyond just grief and sadness. Like, she's having a physical emergency right now. And so one of Lauren's daughters picked up the phone and called 911. A few minutes later, an ambulance arrived, and they would take Lauren to a local hospital. But as soon as they got there, the doctors and nurses determined that very likely Lauren had had a heart attack. And even though she was basically stable right now, their fear is she was going to have another one, and this particular local hospital just lacked the resources and staff to actually treat Lauren. And so they pretty much immediately transferred Lauren to another hospital called the JW Memorial Hospital in Morgantown, West Virginia, because that hospital had a specialized cardiac care unit for people with very serious heart problems. Dr. Konrad Falinger was the cardiologist on duty at JW Memorial Hospital when Lauren was brought into the intensive care unit, followed closely behind by her 3 adult children. Now, Dr. Falinger was used to seeing worried families in the hospital, but Lauren's kids looked far more distressed than he was used to seeing. And when he spoke to Lauren's kids about, what's going on with Lauren, he would see why. The doctor would learn that this family has lost their father, their husband, just a few hours earlier, and the mother, Lauren, who's this patient, she laid with her dead husband out on the road in a pool of blood, and now these poor kids who've just lost their father, they're seeing their mother go to the ICU for what looks like a heart attack. I mean, this was a total worst case scenario where basically everything was going wrong for this family. Dr. Falinger did his best to push his emotions to the side. He didn't want to get wrapped up emotionally in this case, but at the same time, the doctor felt a very deep need to save Lauren. Like, let this family have one good thing happen to them. But Lauren's condition was pretty dire. Just like the doctors at that local hospital where Lauren went first, Dr. Falinger also suspected Lauren had a heart attack, very likely because of that blood circulation disorder that she had that basically clogged her arteries. When an artery in the heart gets blocked, the blood can't circulate in the heart, and so the heart dies. And preliminary testing on Lauren showed there was already signs of damage to her heart, in the same way that a heart attack would damage a heart. Her heartbeat was also irregular, and it was too fast, and her blood pressure was dangerously low. And then also, when Dr. Falinger looked at some imaging of Lauren's heart, he could see that the majority of her heart muscle wasn't even moving. Basically, Lauren's heart was working way harder and way faster than it should be to accomplish nothing. And so, very quickly, Dr. Falinger realized that unless he was able to find the blocked artery in Lauren's heart and clear it, that Lauren would die. And so Dr. Falinger looked up at Lauren's 3 kids who were just standing there in silence, waiting for more bad news. And Dr. Falinger said to them, "Your mom needs to go into surgery right now." Nurses wheeled Lauren out of the ICU and into surgery, where she was immediately put under anesthesia. Once Lauren was ready, Dr. Falinger watched on a monitor as another surgeon fed a thin, flexible tube called a catheter into an artery in Lauren's leg and then fed it up towards her heart. This surgery was called cardiac angioplasty. Basically, that surgeon was going to use that catheter, that tube, and put it into Lauren's heart and then shoot dye through that catheter tube into the blood in Lauren's heart. And then Dr. Falinger and the other doctors could watch to see where this dye went. If the dye was pumped out of the heart like it should be, they'd see it go in all different directions. But if at some point on the monitor the dye just stopped inside the heart and didn't go anywhere, then that would mean they found a blockage. And so when the surgeon had the catheter in Lauren's heart, he injected the dye and they all watched on the monitor, and her heart functioned completely fine. There was no blockage in her heart. Now, the doctors weren't entirely convinced yet that there was no blockage, so they pulled that catheter out and they got a different one, and they went through the exact procedure all over again to see if maybe that catheter was malfunctioning. But again, that second time, the dye didn't stop anywhere. Her heart seemed to be functioning totally normally. And so Dr. Falinger and the rest of the doctors and surgeons, they were all totally baffled, because what this meant was whatever was happening to Lauren, or whatever did happen to Lauren, was not a heart attack. But make no mistake, Lauren's heart was still absolutely dying. It was just some other thing killing it. Dr. Falinger went back to the drawing board, but realistically, there just weren't that many other things to consider with regards to what was happening to Lauren. Heavy alcohol use could in theory cause what was happening to Lauren, but Lauren didn't drink. Infection was another option, but Lauren showed no signs of having an infection. Certain chemotherapy drugs have been known to damage the heart, but Lauren wasn't on chemo and certainly would not have accidentally been exposed to chemo drugs without knowing about it. And so basically, Dr. Falinger had no clue what was wrong with Lauren, and he didn't even know where to start. And so Dr. Falinger just sat in his office feeling so bad about the fact that, these kids are almost certainly gonna lose their other parent. I mean, it was his duty to save Lauren, and he couldn't do it, and he just felt so bad. He couldn't even imagine how he was gonna deliver the news to the kids that, your mom's gonna die and we don't know why. I mean, this was the worst for Dr. Falinger. He felt like he had failed as a doctor. But just then, Dr. Falinger has this epiphany. He remembers this weird medical article he had read somewhat recently, and he realized what was going on with Lauren and her family was like the same thing that happened in that article. And because Dr. Falinger did not have any other ideas of how to handle what was going on with Lauren, he he decided he would just try to do what they did in that article, because if he was wrong, he had nothing to lose. So Dr. Falinger got up and he ran to Lauren's hospital room, and when he got in there, he saw Lauren's kids and he called them over to him, and he would tell them that he's going to give their mom some medication that's going to spike her blood pressure and keep it high, but then he needs them to gather around her and just talk to her like she's your mom. Talk lovingly, soothingly, remind her that you're still here and that everything is okay. And the kids, they all agreed to do this. And then Dr. Falinger, he gave the medicine to Lauren, and then he watched as her 3 kids circled up around the head of the bed, and they're all crying and holding their mom and telling her how much they love her and please come back to us, come back. And as they're doing this, Dr. Falinger just quietly walked out of the room, hoping this would work. And sure enough, just a week later, Lauren was all better. It would turn out the way in which Lauren lost her husband, both the suddenness of getting that phone call, combined with just the unthinkable horror of seeing your loved one on the road in a pool of blood dead. I mean, that situation was so stressful for Lauren that her brain released a ton of stress hormones into her body. So much so that these stress hormones literally paralyzed her heart. And so you can understand why all the doctors thought this was a heart attack, because this sort of looked like one. But this condition does have its own name. It's called stress cardiomyopathy. However, it's known by its more casual name, which is broken heart syndrome. Basically, Lauren loved her husband so much that to witness what happened to him and to learn about it so suddenly and abruptly, it nearly killed her. And it just so happens that a few months before Lauren was checked into the hospital, Dr. Falinger happened to read a medical article about broken heart syndrome. And the only way you can treat broken heart syndrome is just to try to keep the patient alive long enough that the stress hormones leave their body naturally, at which point their heart goes back to normal. And so Dr. Falinger was able to buy Lauren a little bit of time right at the end there by giving her that medicine that boosted her blood pressure. But Dr. Falinger told her 3 kids that really it was up to them to keep their mother alive. They needed to crowd around their mom and just talk to her and tell her that you love her, show her that you're here with her, give her a reason to fight and hold on. Even though she's not saying or doing anything, she's still alive and she can hear you. So talk to her. And so Lauren's kids just sat around their mother and just showered her with love and affection. And sure enough, a few days later, when Lauren did kind of come out of it and recover, she would say that she felt herself drifting off towards death. I mean, she really knew she was dying. But then she remembers hearing her kids calling to her and saying how much they loved her and to please come back. We need you. We already lost Dad. We got to keep you. And Lauren would say that's the reason she's still here today, is because she held on for her kids. She felt like it was her duty to be here for her family. And so that's what saved her life.